The Virtuoso, Chapter 6. A loud crash woke Isabel with a start. With bleary eyes and a pounding heart, she glanced at the bedside clock. It was 2 a.m. She rubbed her eyes. "Howard, is that you?" There was no reply, and the darkness that surrounded her suddenly felt oppressive. Isabel staggered through the bedroom onto the landing, arms outstretched as she entered into the blackness. She reached for the banister and tentatively descended the stairs. She could hear nothing but her now erratic and raspy breathing. Her heart was racing at the thought of what she might find lurking in the shadows. Her hands began to shake slightly as fear took hold. Her disheveled hair hung languidly around her smooth olive shoulders. Each stair creaked as she slowly placed one foot in front of the other. Moonlight streamed in through the half-crescent window at the top of the front door, lending an even more eerie feeling to the already creepy atmosphere. Negotiating her way past familiar objects in the moonlit hallway, she entered the kitchen and switched on the light. For a brief second, she blinked as her eyes adjusted to the brightness. And then she could make out Howard slumped over the pine table, whiskey glass in one hand and a magazine in the other. He raised his head menacingly. "Howard, you scared me. I thought the house was being broken into. Where have you been?" As she approached him, she noticed he looked disheveled. There was no foliage, but the stench of alcohol hit her nostrils, and she recoiled. He fumbled with the buttons on his waistcoat and glared at her. "When were you going to tell me about this?" He slammed the High Notes magazine onto the table. "Today, as it happens. I was hoping that you'd have been home earlier so that we could have a chat. It's late now, and I can see you're not in the right state of mind. We're certainly not going to resolve any of our marital problems while you're filthy drunk." She turned away from him to go back upstairs, but had only moved a few yards before she felt his vice-like grip on her arm. Unbelievably, he traveled like a gazelle across the kitchen, knocking his chair over as he lunged toward her. She pulled away, and he moved closer, stamping on her foot as he asserted his hold. His heavy walking boot left a muddy mark. The pain was excruciating. Isabel bent down to rub her foot. "Howard, for God's sake, you're hurting me!" Howard marched her over to the fallen chair. He picked it up with one hand and then pushed her roughly down with both arms. She was shaking all over now and feeling more vulnerable. She sat shivering in her silk nightslip with her foot throbbing. He pressed his knees over hers and stooped over her. She didn't look him in the eye. "It's time we had a talk now, isn't it, you little tramp?" His face was inches from her. His complexion was sweaty and pallid. Isabel turned her head to the side and her neck flushed with the warmth of his stinking breath. "This debacle has Goldberg written all over it. You've become one of those fucking celebrity whores." Spittle sprang from his mouth. He lowered his voice. "When did fame become more important to you than art? You're married into a respectable family now. You can't go flaunting your body around like some cheap slut. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for me and my family? I will not let you tarnish our reputation." His breath was overpowering. "Howard, I think you're being unreasonable. I didn't ask to be voted for. I didn't even know about the poll until Jerry told me. There are plenty of other serious musicians in the same category. It doesn't mean I'm of dubious morals or wanting to spice up my image. I suppose James Jackson had a good gop over you this afternoon. I thought we agreed that you'd run any publicity past me, you selfish bitch. Howard, listen to yourself. You're being abusive. You deserve it, you lying slut." He slapped her hard across the cheek, and Isabel's head followed his blow. A red welt mark instantly formed on her cheek. She could taste salt now that tears were streaming down her face. She glared up at him in defiance. "Don't fucking give me the waterworks. You think I've got any sympathy for you?" He sneered and stood up fully, pushing his tousled hair away from his forehead. Seeing his slightly relaxed stance, she kicked out with all her strength. Howard groaned as she made contact with his testicles. By now her adrenaline was surging, and she pushed him back a few paces as he was doubled over. It had given her enough time to get to the other side of the table, where she stood facing him. "Look, Howard, we can talk about this calmly when you've sobered up. I don't want to fight. I thought you might at least be pleased about the radio interview. I've finally overcome my fear of public speaking. You made yourself look like a silly tart, and it's going to stop, or else." She bolted towards the stairs, with Howard in pursuit, still wincing from the blow to his groin and gripped by blind rage. Isabel had reached the 4th step, but then felt him tug firmly on her bruised foot, and she cried out. Howard dragged her back down, and she grimaced in pain with each bump. He pinned her to the bottom of the stairs. "You whores are never content with what you got." His features contorted. "You're insatiable, always wanting more. I'm going to give you more than you bargained for." She glimpsed his mad eyes, his broken glasses from the tussle, and just as his intention sunk in his vice-like mouth was on hers, practically biting her lips. She vainly struggled, but he had gravity on his side. His hand was ripping the delicate silk and clutching her exposed breast. She cried again in pain. He took his arm away to undo his flies. With one last burst of anger, she pushed him backwards, and he lurched, temporarily losing his balance on the step. Without thinking, Isabel threw herself past him, grasping at the wall where the car keys hung. She pulled frantically to unhook her keys. Fumbling in her haste, she almost dropped the keys as she flung open the front door. The cold night air hit her bruised flesh like another slap in the face, but all she could think of was getting to the safety of the car. She hobbled over the gravel in her bare feet and pressed the fob. It bleeped and the car lights flashed. She opened the driver's door and turned towards the house to see how far behind Howard was. Her left hand was resting on the rim of the door as her body leaned on the rear passenger door. "Where do you think you're going, slut?" His voice cut through the dark. "Away from you, Howard, you demented bastard! I can't live like this anymore!" They stood inert for a second, staring at each other. For an inexplicable reason, Isabel felt rooted to the spot. Her legs were numb and leaden. She just couldn't move fast enough. Howard, sensing her delay, propelled himself toward her in fury. He was suddenly upon her and pitched himself at the car door with all his body weight behind it. She could not avoid the high-velocity door. Impact was inevitable. Then she screamed in agony. She looked down, but her eyes didn't register what they saw. She felt and saw the warm spray of gushing red liquid as she held up what remained of her left hand in front of her. Her eyes were fixed on her torn, jagged flesh and protruding bones now bathed in blood. Throbbing, searing pain shot through her hand. Her two middle fingers had fallen to the ground, and her little finger was dangling from the first joint, like some gory model from a horror movie special effects workshop. She was looking at her knuckles inside out. Disbelief filled her entire being at the sight before her. She was staring at her exposed joints. In a reflex action, she tried to bend her fingers even though they weren't attached to her hand any longer. More blood flowed out. She couldn't take it in. Although shock had lessened the initial agony, her breathing had become fast and shallow. She staggered and watched her breath swirl and spiral upwards into the freezing night air. She felt lightheaded, her balance faltered. Isabel thudded against the car and slid to the ground, holding her mangled hand out in front of her. Two of her decapitated, slender fingers lay on the ground next to her, a pool of crimson gathering around them. Her red and sodden silk gown felt cold against her body as the saturated material from her warm blood had rapidly cooled in the freezing night air. The color drained from her face and her head began spinning. Suddenly she couldn't breathe. Howard's face became blurry, and all she could make out was the crescent of the moon. Above her, stars were glimmering in all their incandescent glory. The last thing she thought she heard was Eric calling her name just before she passed out.